Hello, good evening. My name is Joel Perez, and today we're going to be talking about drugs in Great Britain. Next, we're moving on to 1908 to 1928. Around this time, a public opinion started changing, essentially because soldiers during World War I were starting to show signs of addiction, which will lead to further regulation a little bit later on. But during 1908, we have the Poisons and Pharmacy Act, which acts almost as an extension to the Pharmacy Act of 1868. Just this time, we'll be labeling all the bottles in context of any medicine of the time and regulate a little bit more heavier the ones that actually have any drugs or illicit drugs on them, such as cocaine, tobacco, or other types of methamphetamines. In 1916, we have the Defense of the Realm Act. Essentially, this restricted the possession of cocaine to authorized persons. Which during 1920, we have the Dangerous Drugs Act, which limited the production, import, export, possession, sales, and distribution of opium, cocaine, morphine, or heroin to only licensed persons. The 1925 Dangerous Drug Act essentially criminalized the possession of cannabis. However, any of the drugs listed prior can now be acquired through, again, a license or through a prescription from a doctor. 1928 was the one that criminalized the possession of cannabis unless you were having a prescription or license. And 1925 essentially just criminalized it. Next, some more historical context. So after 1928, we have what's known as the British system of drug policy. While the US was in turn having their own drug policy revival, where they were criminalizing a lot of drugs, the British were actually allowing drug users to continue using drugs through prescriptions from doctors. However, this did little to address the underlying issues of drug abuse, and besides that, it actually did manage to keep crime rate low, or for example, drug crime low. During 1961, we start increasing the control on drugs. A lot of this is really due to exterior pressures placed on Britain. The rest of the world was starting to have a one unified perspective on how drug policy should be handled, and the British, due to a lot of external pressure, just followed through with like other countries and their policies instead of really listening to like any internal pressures going on there. So during the 1961 Internal Single Convention on Narcotics Drugs, which was held, it essentially condemned drug addiction in general, and also did make it so it was a crime to be prescribing drugs in order to feed an addiction, which is technically what the British were doing at the time. During the 1960s, essentially the Dangerous Drug Act was in place, which was almost a couple of years after the UN 1961 Single Convention and criminalization of criminal cannabis. The Drugs Prevention and Misuse Act essentially criminalized the possession of methamphetamines. So we start now getting into the criminalization of actual people that were doing drugs. Next, we have the 1967 Dangerous Drug Act, which requires doctor to notify home office of an addict patients. So if you were an addicted patient and you came to your doctor trying to ask them for drugs, they will be required to notify you and terminate your prescriptions of any drugs that you're getting from them. Moving into the 1970s, in 1971, we have the Misuse of Drugs Act, which essentially set up a system classifying drugs according to their perceived harmfulness, created offense of intent to supply, and set harsher penalties for trafficking and supplying these drugs. And we also have the establishment of the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs in order to proceed with any new drugs that get developed in the future and how it should be criminalized or labeled. In 1985, we have the Controlled Drugs Penalty Act, which essentially is increasing the maximum penalty for trafficking Class A drugs for 14 years to life imprisonment. So now we start getting on the harsh or more policy that's in regards to harsher on crime or tough on crime policies. During this time, when the US was experiencing that, the rest of the world was almost following suit. Well, for the most part. And British being another English-speaking country, they also followed through the U.S.'s example of being tough on crime. However, it is important to note prior to 1960, the British was actually not having that much problems with drug use because of their prescription method or the British system that he had in place. And they were experiencing little crime in regards to drug use. It wouldn't be until he started criminalizing drugs where we started seeing a rise in organized crime and a rise in drug usage within the general populace. Next, in 1986, we have the Drug Trafficking Offense Act. It essentially created an offense of making suspects aware of an investigation. It also really empowered police to compel breaches of confidentiality in search and seize materials and assets. And now we're going to be talking about the 1990s and 2000s. Here we start going a little bit more into how health and criminal justice can be integrated, which is something similar that we saw happening to us here in the US. So in 1991, we had the Criminal Justice Act, which essentially Schedule 1A6 allowed for the condition of attending drug treatment to be attached to a probation order. So if you were scheduled for a probation order after a court, you can also be attached for drug treatment as well, which is a really big thing for the time. In 1998, we have the Crime and Disorder Act, which created drug treatment and testing order. So that means after you get let loose from prison, if you test positive for drugs, you might get sent back for extra jail time or be penalized for that. In 2000, we have the Criminal Justice and Court Service Act, which established police to drug test people charged with trigger offenses, created the drug abstinence order, the drug abstinence requirement, and testing for supervised release prisoners. Yeah. Historical context, again, part 2 for 1990s and 2000s. We have the 2003 Criminal Justice Act, which established restrictions on bail for someone arrested who tests positive for Class A drug use, created a generic community order, replacing the DTTO previously mentioned in one of the other laws with the drug rehabilitation requirement. Anti-Social Behavior Act was also established during this year, which essentially powers to close premises used for Class A drugs. Next, we have 2005 Drugs Act, which introduced the drug testing on arrests. In 2006, we now have the Police and Justice Act, and it extends to the conditional cautioning scheme to provide punitive conditions to be attached as well. So now we're going to move on to the drug map of Great Britain today. And as taking a quick look at it, most of it is just amphetamines and cocaine, heroin, anabolic steroids. It's a lot of heavy hitting drugs. Now, it's also good to note that the number of drug offenses in the United Kingdom between 2002/3 to 2019 to 20, we can see here a rise in drug offenses happening. So during the time where we started getting a little bit harsher on crime, we started getting a rise in drug offenses per 1,000 people per capita. Now, with the new rising conditions, we now have a small rise going up again. So we're going to start seeing that trend of another wave of drug using in London. Here we have regional drug issues. So for example, Scotland and Valium, again, this is just going over like more recent stuff that the UK is dealing with. First of all, they're going over through a Valium crisis over there, where because number one, Valium is actually readily available drug and it's very cheap to buy. A pack of 10 pills can only cost you up to £10. Most of these people overdose because you start building up a tolerance to Valium. So once their peak is 5, their peak maybe next week will be 10, and so on until you just OD on it. Another regional drug issue that's very current right now is actually London and the amount of cocaine that it uses. Cocaine usage has been increased in London. A lot of it has to do with how socially acceptable the drug is over there. Another thing is London actually does consume a lot of cocaine to the point where it becomes an issue of criminality because this cocaine is honestly being shipped in from overseas and from other organized crime organizations, which has a bunch of problems on all within on its own. So sources of drugs. First, we're going to start off with domestic sources of drugs. First of all, drugs can be grown. Another really interesting domestic source can actually be drugs that are stolen or sold from pharmacies or other medical establishments. So over here, we have two dudes literally stealing drugs from a pharmacy. So these are our three primary domestic sources of drugs. Next, we're going to have our international routes of drugs. So number one is from overseas. So a lot of the entryways of drugs, again, is another big one, is importation. Interestingly, now since we live in a world that's a little bit more brought in together based off the internet, because of globalization, we now actually have now the Silk Road, which is an online website where you can buy any drugs you want. So what is the police response to drug crime? First of all, we now have a crackdown on organized crime because drug trafficking and the distribution of illicit drugs is one of the main sources or one of the biggest sources of revenue for a lot of organized crime industries. Much of the funds gathered here can actually be used to fund other criminal enterprises such as human trafficking schemes or distribution of illegal pornography. Next is also taking actions within the UK itself. So for example, they're strengthening their border forces. This can be everything from having more of a coast guard set up, making sure that every planes are being labeled, they're following air traffic, making sure everything's followed through. We now also have, which is another good goal, is reducing demands of drugs. The way the UK goes about this is by setting harsher crime laws for being in possession of drugs or being a drug user or trying to sell drugs. Now, here we have the issues of criminalizing drug users. So, for example, previous drug policies have actually just focused on criminalizing and punishing the drug user for what they're doing. However, this really isn't the most best approach to go about it. Reason number one is that addicts are actually going to be less likely to seek out help due to the fact that they're going to face judicial repercussions. So other issues is that future prospects are ruined due to social labeling of serving time in prison. So if you do end up time in prison, it's going to be a lot harder for you to nail a job or do anything you want to do within society, rather if you just keep it to yourself. And lastly, we have that laws actually failed as a deterrent for drug abuse because we still have drug abusers, even though there are harsh laws. So the new wave of drug policies will shift their idea from addiction being a public health issue. So we're going to start looking at drug addiction more as a health issue rather than putting you in jail, and hopefully jail can sort you out. By reducing harm addiction and decriminalizing drug users, this will be a really big step forward into getting a lot of the people clean in Britain. Another important thing is that a lot of the critics say that drugs, again, are feeding into the pockets of organized crime syndicates or actually terrorism themselves, terrorists. One way to counter that, again, with the new wave policy, is by regulating the sales of drugs by the government in order to cut out that criminal element of drug usage. Lastly, here we have our sources. And again, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure talking to you all. Have a great night and great rest of the semester.